Our next panelist is a Toronto lawyer who's been serving as legal counsel in litigating and consulting on this crazy, complex Canadian cannabis and medical marijuana legal landscape. So I'll let him jump right in and explain a little bit what he's been up to, some really exciting progress, and especially now that we have this kind of an announcement, you can maybe run down some of the things that the government has told us and break it down for us. And I heard you're open to questions, right?
Yeah, I think lots of questions I think would be a great way to do it.
Okay, perfect. So we'll let you kind of start, and then when you're ready, I'll throw to questions from the audience. So start thinking, guys.
Okay, cool. So my name is Jack Lloyd. I'm a lawyer in Toronto.
Welcome, Jack, guys.
So originally Paul Lewin was going to speak, but he's unable to be here today, so I'm going to take his space. We're talking about dispensaries. I think there'll be a real focus on dispensaries in Ontario, but we can deal with dispensaries outside of Ontario as well if you would like. And so I think maybe we could focus on what the provincial government's announcement means for existing dispensaries in Ontario and elsewhere. If there are questions, that's great. Otherwise, I might just sort of go through the outline of dispensary prosecutions as far. I deal largely with employees at medical cannabis dispensaries. I represent a large number of them. In the history of, since Project Claudia, I think the longest jail time anyone has faced was 3 months for an individual held pending a determination of they couldn't get bail. So as far as incarceration levels, it's not particularly high, but it is a very, very large number of young people facing serious trafficking charges, which is a public health issue in and of itself. I've been sort of saying that for a while. In regards to the legality of dispensaries, it's still technically illegal, and the government's announced no intention whatsoever to license privately owned recreational cannabis dispensaries. However, interestingly, the medical cannabis program is still, it's not provincially mandated, it's going to remain federal. And so there's a number of injunctions ongoing, at least in Ontario, and I believe in BC as well, dealing with whether or not reasonable access includes privately owned medical cannabis dispensaries. And Adam Greenblatt actually spoke very, very eloquently about that on his panel. I really appreciated that because I think it is a sensible model to follow. And I think that there is a path forward for that through these injunctions in the event that we win and the ACMPR is overthrown or at least ruled unconstitutional insofar as they don't authorize these private spaces in which medical cannabis patients can access. In regards to Ontario, so the plan is for the LCBO to take over all retail distribution, online and storefront. So within that, implicitly, is an agreement that storefronts are the way that people want to access cannabis, so they've voted with their feet. And insofar as storefronts are concerned, they did hear that. They just haven't issued the storefronts that many people, I think, wanted, which was privately owned. So we'll have 50. They've announced that they're going to target areas with a high concentration of illegal cannabis dispensaries. So I think not only are they taking the storefront model from the gray market, they're also using their market data to locate their shops, which I found very interesting. One of the concerns I had actually in regards to access is there's probably 600 LCBOs and John Conroy actually mentioned this to me yesterday. It was a really good point that sometimes there's sub-licensors that have an LCBO vending permit in smaller, more remote communities. And I think that with 50 dispensaries from the government popping up, I don't think that rural communities will be particularly well served by them. So I think that the gray black market will continue to exist in those areas because I just don't think it's feasible for someone to drive from Barrie to Toronto to access medical cannabis. So essentially, right now, my focus is injunctions to protect medical cannabis dispensaries as access points, and we'll see if we can win that and keep that dialogue going. In regards to dispensary prosecutions in Toronto, I think at present there's about 220 individuals facing charges simply for working at medical cannabis dispensaries. The charges have changed somewhat, so they've been rating them about once a week for 16 months now. So I'm in bail court Monday to Friday generally, I find, and one of the changes that's happened in enforcement that's quite disappointing, to be frank, is security guards now are being arrested. And so last year, Toronto Police set up a meeting with dispensary owners and advocacy groups and said every single dispensary needs to have a licensed security guard on staff at all times. It's a public health issue. So all the dispensaries hired security guards, and now when they raid one of these shops, they're arresting security guards, which is problematic. So in regards to, there was a medical cannabis dispensary that had its employees unionized through Unifor, which I was very excited about, because I said, oh, I'm going to have all these awesome union lawyers in bail court with me, but they have, as of yet, offered no legal support to my clients. Essentially, that's the outline of where we're at right now. So there's September 25 to 26, there's going to be an injunction heard. John Conroy, Paul Lewin, and Kirk Tusaw are counsel. Hopefully, it's going to hold off the granting of an interim injunction, so a shutdown order for a chain of medical cannabis dispensaries. If they win that and keep it open, then there will be a constitutional hearing in December on that issue. I have a case in Hamilton for Kirk Tusaw that dealt with a dispensary. An injunction was brought, and the hearing was on a much more aggressive timeline. Regardless, the hearing happened, and the court ruled that it was allowed to remain open so long as it only provided cannabis to medically approved patients. So this was a big victory, really, in regard. That was good. So that's about the landscape in Ontario right now. Alberta, I have about 9 clients in Alberta that are facing charges, and they want jail for dispensary workers. So that's not as good an atmosphere, at least as Toronto. And the East Coast as well, interestingly, I think I'm not sure if they're going to be influenced by Ontario's decision to have government-owned dispensaries, or if they're going to license privately owned dispensaries. There has been a crackdown there recently, so it's unclear. So that's essentially the gamut of what I wanted to talk about. I was hopeful that folks would have questions. If you do have any questions.
Anybody? Well, I'll ask the first one, and maybe it'll get people's minds thinking. We were talking a little bit about, before you were speaking, my curiosity is the government's coming down and warning about a crackdown of these dispensaries and saying you're on your final notice. But in my thought process, if the rationale has been that these dispensaries can stay open because medical access is so bad, I can only see medical access getting worse and more strained. So does that not make their legal ground almost stronger in that sense?
Well, I'm not sure if the access argument gets stronger, but I think that from a common sense perspective, it's clear that implicitly they're saying storefronts are an important way of accessing cannabis for this community. Particularly, there's a lot of problems with the mail order system that are exacerbated for individuals that are in medically or financially vulnerable positions. So the storefront model it's a smart one and makes sense. So again, on these injunctions, if we can win, then we could sort of shoehorn in a storefront model that's privately owned, separate from the government-owned program. And I think that's really the only way forward that I can see for privately owned dispensaries to have a legal grounding for their existence. So it's the judicial, only through the courts is that going to happen. So
what do you is there a way to refer to that as when it's technically illegal, but through through an injunction the court has granted an exception? Or
yeah, I think it would be an injunction would be the term. Yeah, a mandatory injunction I think would be. I'm not an injunction lawyer. I had to sort of learn it ad hoc. So you could ask for a mandatory injunction demanding that they issue some sort of permit for their existence there. until they prove that their program is constitutional insofar as it doesn't offer storefronts. Because they could just respond and say, okay, fine, we're going to issue 5 storefronts. They're all in Toronto, and that's constitutional. And then you have to do it all over again and push the rock back up the hill.
Right.
So,
which is almost surprising that hasn't happened.
well, no challenge to. There hasn't been a challenge to the ACMPR yet. There hasn't been time. So the first is going to be December with John and Paul Lewin and Kirk Tusaw.
Okay, perfect. And I mean, too, it's kind of surprising that the government hasn't done a couple, put 3 and said there, you know.
Well, I think that's a possibility, right? Is that they'll just say, okay, fine, you can have a storefront. There's one in Hamilton, in some obscure place, and another in Toronto, and then wash their hands of it, and then you have to do the challenge all over again.
Right.
But I think actually if on the municipal laws, if you get an injunction that says they can stay in the same way that John did in Insight, I think similarly, you can have this space protected by a court order, and if they don't appeal it, then it could continue for as long as the court order stands, so long as they don't breach it. So I think there's a path forward. I don't know what it is yet, but
we're getting there. It's early. It's just,
it's in that space.
Some great stuff to mull over. Anybody else have any questions? Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time. Really enlightening. I think we're all just digesting. It's been a lot. Thanks.